just what we don't need. More gun-toting, taser-wielding cops in government-run schools that, believe it or not, bear an uncomfortable resemblance to prisons. Microcosms of the police state. America's public schools already contain almost every aspect of the militarized, intolerant, senseless, overcriminalized, legalistic, surveillance-ridden, totalitarian landscape that plagues those of us on the so-called outside. Now, President Trump and Attorney General Jeff Sessions want to double down on these totalitarian echo chambers. Sessions has announced that the Justice Department will provide funding for schools that want to hire more resource officers, as they're so called. The White House has also hinted that it may repeal Rethink School Discipline policies, heralding a return to zero-tolerance policies that treat children like suspects and criminals, especially in America's public schools. As for Trump, he wants to harden the schools. That's his quote. What exactly does hardening the schools entail? More strident zero-tolerance policies, greater numbers of school cops, and all the trappings of a prison complex. Just when you thought this administration couldn't get any more tone-deaf about civil liberties in our Constitution, they prove once again they have absolutely no regard for the Constitution, especially our Fourth Amendment. No concept of limited government. No concern for the growing need to protect we the people against an overreaching, overbearing police state. Folks, America's schools today are already about as authoritarian as they come. From the moment a child enters one of the nation's 98,000 public schools to the moment he or she graduates, they will be exposed to a steady diet of draconian, zero-tolerance policies that criminalize childish behavior, overreaching, anti-bullying statutes that criminalize speech, school resource officers or police tasked with disciplining and or arresting so-called disorderly students, politically correct mindsets that teach young people to censor themselves and those around them, and extensive biometric and surveillance systems that, coupled with the rest, acclimate young people to a world in which they have no freedom of thought, speech, or movement. Young people in America today are now the first in line to be searched, surveilled, spied on, threatened, tied up, locked down, treated like criminals for non-criminal behavior, tasered, and in some cases actually shot. Roped into the government's profit-driven campaign to keep the nation safe from drugs, weapons, and terrorism, many schools have transformed themselves into quasi-prisons, complete with surveillance cameras, metal detectors, police patrols, believe it or not, zero-tolerance policies, lockdowns, drug-sniffing dogs, strip searches, and active shooter drills. It used to be that if you talked back to a teacher or played a prank on a classmate or just failed to do your homework, you might find yourself in detention or doing an extra writing assignment after school. That's no longer the case. Nowadays, students are not only punished for minor transgressions such as playing cops and robbers on the playground, bringing Legos to school, or having a food fight, but the punishments have become far more severe, shifting from detention and visits to the principal's office into misdemeanor tickets, juvenile court, handcuffs, tasers, and even prison terms. Prison terms? Students have been suspended under school zero-tolerance policies for bringing to school look-alike substances such as oregano, breath mints, birth control pills, and powdered sugar, look-alike weapons, toy guns, or even Lego-sized ones, hand-drawn pictures of guns, pencils twirled in a threatening manner, imaginary bows and arrows, even fingers positioned like guns, can also land a student in very, very hot water. Even good deeds do not go unpunished. One 13-year-old was given detention for exposing the school to liability by sharing his lunch with a hungry friend. A third grader was suspended for shaving her head in sympathy for a friend who had lost her hair to chemotherapy. And then there was the high school senior who was suspended for saying "bless you" after a fellow classmate sneezed. In South Carolina, where it's against the law to disturb a school, more than 1,000 students a year, some as young as 7 years old, face criminal charges for not following directions, loitering, cursing, or the vague allegation of acting obnoxiously. If charged as adults, they can be held in jail for up to 90 days. Increasingly, the number of cops in the schools only adds to the problem. Indeed, the growing presence of police in the nation's schools is resulting in greater police involvement in routine discipline matters that principals and parents used to address without involvement from law enforcement officers. Indeed, these school resource officers have become de facto wardens in elementary, middle, and high schools, doling out their own brand of justice to the so-called criminals in their midst with the help of tasers, pepper spray, batons, and brute force. The horror stories are legion. One school resource officer is accused of punching a 13-year-old student in the face for cutting into the cafeteria line. That same cop put another student in a chokehold a week later, alleging knocking the student unconscious and causing a brain injury. In Pennsylvania, a student was tasered after ignoring an order to put his cell phone away. When 13-year-old John Batiste failed to follow a school bus driver's direction to keep the bus windows closed, he suffers from asthma. He opened the window after a fellow student sprayed perfume, causing him to cough and wheeze. He was handcuffed by police, believe it or not, removed from the bus, and while he was still handcuffed, had his legs swept out from under him by an officer, causing him to crash to the ground. Young Alex Stone didn't even make it past the first week of school before he became a victim of the police state. Directed by his teacher to do a creative writing assignment involving a series of fictional Facebook statuses, Stone wrote, "I killed my neighbor's pet dinosaur. I bought the gun to take care of the business." Despite the fact that dinosaurs are extinct, the status fabricated, and the South Carolina student was merely following orders, Alex's teacher reported him to school administrators, who in turn called the police. What followed is par for the course in schools today. Students were locked down into their classrooms while armed police searched the 16-year-old's locker and book bag, handcuffed him, charged him with disorderly conduct of disturbing the school, arrested him, detained him, and then he was suspended from school. Not even the younger elementary school age kids are being spared from these kind of hardening techniques, as Trump calls it. On any given day when the schools are in session, kids who act up in class are pinned face down on the floor, locked in dark closets, tied up with straps, bungee cords, and duct tape, handcuffed, leg shackled, tasered or otherwise restrained, immobilized or placed in solitary confinement in order to bring them under control, as it's called. In almost every case, these undeniably harsh methods are used to punish kids, some as young as 4 and 5 years old, for simply failing to follow directions or throwing tantrums. Very rarely do these kids pose any credible danger to themselves or others. Unbelievably, these tactics are all legal, at least when employed by school officials and school resource officers in the nation's public schools. This is what happens when you introduce police and police tactics into the schools. By the time you add in the lockdowns and active shooter drills, instead of making the schools any safer, school officials have succeeded in creating an environment in which children are so traumatized that they suffer from post-traumatic stress disorder, nightmares, anxiety, mistrust of adults and authority, as well as feelings of anger, depression, humiliation, despair, and delusion. Police officers at a Florida middle school carried out an active shooter drill in an effort to educate students about how to respond in the event of an actual shooting crisis. 2 armed officers, guns loaded and drawn, burst into classrooms, terrorizing the students and placing the school into a lockdown mode. If these exercises are intended to instill fear and compliance into young people, they're working, folks. In fact, the toll such incidents take on adults can be life-altering. But when such police brutality is perpetuated on young people, the end result is nothing less than complete indoctrination into becoming compliant citizens of a totalitarian state. Schools acting like prisons, school officials acting like wardens, students treated like inmates, and punished like hardened criminals. This is the end product of all those so-called school safety policies, which run the gamut from zero tolerance policies that punish all infractions harshly, so harshly, to surveillance cameras, metal detectors, random searches, drug-sniffing dogs, school-wide lockdowns, active shooter drills, and militarized police. There can be no avoiding the hands-on lessons being taught in the schools about the role of police in our lives, ranging from the active shooter drills and school-wide lockdowns to incidents in which children engaging in typically childlike behavior are suspended for shooting an imaginary bow and arrow at a fellow classmate, handcuffed, or what? For being disruptive at school, arrested for throwing water balloons as part of a school prank, and even tasered for not obeying so-called instructions. Instead of raising up a generation of freedom fighters, which one would hope would be the objective of the schools, government officials seem very determined to churn out newly minted citizens of the American police state who are being taught the hard way what it means to comply, fear, and march in lockstep with the government's dictates. So what's the answer? Not only for the here and now, with the children growing up in these quasi-prisons, but for the future of this country. How do you convince a child who has been routinely handcuffed, shackled, tied down, locked up, and immobilized by government officials, all before he reaches the age of adulthood, that he has any rights at all, let alone the right to challenge wrongdoing, resist oppression, and defend himself against injustice? Most of all, how do you persuade a fellow American that the government works for him when for most of his young life he has been incarcerated in an institution that teaches young people to be obedient and compliant citizens who don't talk back, don't question, and don't challenge authority? Peter Gray, who's a professor of psychology at Boston University, has said that school is a prison that is damaging our children. And it's hard to disagree with that, especially with the number of police officers being assigned to America's schools, and it's on the rise. Students, in turn, are not only finding themselves subjected to police tactics of the most brutal kind, such as handcuffs, leg shackles, tasers, and excessive force for merely acting up, but they're also being ticketed, fined, and sent to court for behavior perceived as defiant, disruptive, or disorderly, such as spraying perfume and writing on a desk. Clearly, the pathology that characterizes the American police state has passed down to the schools. And now, in addition to the government and its agents viewing all the citizenry as suspects to be probed, poked, pinched, tasered, searched, seized, stripped, and generally manhandled, all with the general blessing of the courts, our children in the public schools are also fair game for school resource officers who taser teenagers and handcuff kindergartners, school officials who have criminalized childhood behavior, school lockdowns, and terror drills that teach your children to fear and comply, and a police state mindset that has transformed the schools into quasi-prisons. Don't even get me started on the school-to-prison pipeline, as it's called, the phenomenon in which children who are suspended or expelled from school have a greater likelihood of ending up in jail. One study found that being suspended or expelled made a student nearly 3 times more likely to come in contact with the juvenile justice system within the next year. By the time the average young person in America finishes their public school education, nearly 1 out of every 3 children of them will have been arrested. Nearly 40% of those young people who are arrested will serve time in a private prison where the emphasis is on making profits for large mega corporations above all else. Indeed, this profit-driven system of incarceration has also given rise to a growth in juvenile prisons and financial incentives for jailing young people. In this way, young people have become easy targets for the private prison industry, which profits from criminalizing childish behavior and jailing young people. None of these tactics are making our communities or our schools any safer, folks. Without a doubt, change is needed, but that will mean taking on the teachers' unions, the school unions, the educators' associations, and the police unions, not to mention the politicians dependent on their votes and all the corporations that profit mightily from an industrial school complex. As we've seen with other issues, any significant reforms will have to start locally and trickle upwards. For starters, parents need to be vocal, visible, and organized and demand that school officials adopt a policy, number one, of positive reinforcement in dealing with behavior issues. 2, minimize the presence in the schools of police officers and cease involving them in student discipline. 3, insist that all behavioral issues be addressed first and foremost with a child's parents before other disciplinary tactics are attempted. If you want a nation of criminals, then treat our citizenry like criminals. If, however, you want young people who grow up seeing themselves as prisoners, run the schools like prisons. If, on the other hand, you want to raise up a generation of freedom fighters who will actually operate with justice, fairness, accountability, and equality towards each other and their government, then run the schools like freedom forums. Remove the metal detectors and surveillance cameras. Reassign the cops elsewhere and start treating our nation's young people like citizens of a republic and not inmates in a police state.